The other day, Donald Trump took to the stage at the UN General Assembly and railed against immigrants. Immigrants everywhere, not just in the US, which he's always had a problem with, and a lot of Americans on the right wing have been really upset about immigrants, aliens, migrants, asylum seekers. And Trump was calling for the entire world to resist immigrants, which is rather bizarre because never in human history has the world been without immigrants. And I find that rather odd in many ways, but one of the ways that I find all this talk rather odd is I am an immigrant. Now, you look at me, I'm very white, I've got a beard, so I must be biologically male, and I'm fairly well off, that's certainly true, but I am an immigrant. I'm not what most people think of as an immigrant. And it's also ironic the timing of this because this week I'll be picking up my permanent residency card, where I am now a permanent resident of the Czech Republic. I was born in the United States, but I moved out of the United States in 2012. So I have been an immigrant for 13 years. Now, being now permanent resident of the Czech Republic, it doesn't mean that I am a Czech citizen, but permanent residency does grant me certain legal rights, including the rights to live and work here in the Czech Republic. Now, I qualify for permanent residency because I've been a very good boy. I've jumped through all of the required hoops and over all the required hurdles. I previously had to go through multiple 2-year temporary status visa applications, and these involved very large fees, lots of paperwork, and yes, they do still do actual paper here in the Czech Republic, and multiple appointments over multiple years at government offices. You jump through all the hoops and you eventually get rewarded with permanent residency, where you don't have to jump through the hoops anymore. And I had to go through this song and dance every 2 years because I was not born here. Only in the country of my birth do I have a near absolute right to live and work in that country. Only that country, and that would be the United States. This is true for every one of us. We are citizens only of the country in which we are born, barring considerable legal maneuvering of removing your citizenship from one country and becoming a citizen of another. So, what does all this mean? Why am I talking about all this? Because it's certainly not my personal story. It's because there is this stigma and this confusion, and a bunch of labels are thrown out there: expat, immigrant, migrant, refugee, alien. Now, the Czech Republic, their government refers to me as a foreigner. I'm a third-party national. And that's much nicer than the country of my birth, the US, which refers to immigrants at best as resident aliens. These word choices say a lot because those terms have normative meanings within social and legal contexts. So, expat, immigrant, migrant, refugee, alien. Those words delineate a spectrum of value judgments on people. In largely unspoken but nevertheless real terms, those words define the perceived value of people. I am not an expat, although some people would call me that. The term expat, to me at least, has connotations of class distinctions that I do not claim for myself. Consider the perceived value differences between the terms expat and refugee. The expat is assumed to be clever, reasonably well off, and have a legitimate reason for being in a foreign country. The expat has a certain cachet long romanticized by literature and movies. Think of Ernest Hemingway as just one example of that. The refugee, though, is considered to be poor, unskilled, and without a good reason to be in a foreign country. Worse, the refugee is often assumed to be a burden or a threat. More charitable people will understand refugees as poor, but in need of compassion and safe harbor from whatever dangers they are fleeing. Let's not pretend there's no prejudice involved in the use of these labels. The labels used express presumptions of who is desirable and who can make desirable contributions to society. Really, it's the question of who has a right to have rights within a society. Expats may seem a bit odd, the people who are expats, but they are generally thought to be acceptable, maybe even welcome. The refugee, maybe not, in the eyes of many closed-minded people. There are some legalities at work here. You have a legal right, as I said, to live and work only in the country in which you are a citizen. The European Union is an exception in that it affords EU citizenship to all citizens of member states of the EU. So, if you are a citizen of one EU country, you have citizenship rights in all 27 EU countries. Still, there is a legal distinction between EU citizens and non-EU citizens in the Czech Republic and all 26 other EU states. I have no absolute right to live in the Czech Republic. I am an immigrant. I need the permission of the government to be here legally. My living here is a privilege granted to me that I cannot demand but can only request. Fortunately, the Czech government grants that permission to me. They see me as a desirable foreigner. I'm not a refugee, I'm not an alien, so they let me stay. And much of my perceived desirability comes from my willingness and ability to go through the proper legal channels. Yes, I am a legal immigrant. Legal because I jumped through all the hoops, filled all the proper forms over and over, paid all of the fees over and over, and waded through all of the delays. Each round, they gave me a card to show my legal status. And this week, I get a new card saying permanent residence. Actually, it'll say Trvalý pobyt or something like that. I'm still horrible in my Czech. It's terrible. Trvalý pobyt. Because, of course, it's Czech. It's a Czech card, and that's their word for permanent resident. But when people talk negatively about immigrants, they often, if not usually, mean illegal immigrants. And that's the difference. Right-wing politicians stroke fears of these immigrants, or as they prefer to call them, migrants, or worse. They're not people. They're never referred to as people, and they're surely not referred to as expats. No, they are labeled migrants, as though they are animals that have strayed into places where they don't belong. And this is where a quandary begins. For me, but certainly not only for me, it should be a quandary for all of us. On the one hand, as a person on the left wing of humanity, I believe in the rule of law being equally applied, rather than the right wing's view of power hierarchies of exclusion. Thus, I believe people should obey the law, including immigration laws. Illegal immigrant is illegal. That's what the law means. That's what those concepts mean. Thus, I believe people should obey the law. On the other hand, I know that immigration laws are difficult to follow and are often, if not usually, set up to discriminate against certain people considered to be undesirable. I am legal because I have had the luxury of being able to be legal. First off, I was not fleeing a war, not fleeing persecution, not escaping a natural disaster. My moves, first to the United Kingdom and then later to the Czech Republic, were entirely voluntary and orderly. And second, I had the financial wherewithal to hire the legal help to file the forms, pay the fees, and wait the months for paperwork to be processed over and over again. Legal immigration is the privileged of the already privileged. When we hear talk of illegal immigrants, we should not rush to judgment as the politicians urge us to do. These immigrants are, first and foremost, people. They are human beings with human rights. The simple reality is too often forgotten. They may be illegal because they are refugees without the time and means to go through proper legal channels, and because, let's face it, they fear for their lives. It's worth remembering that the legal channels that governments set up are often deliberately made difficult to access and navigate. So here's the quandary. We cannot assume that illegal immigrants are the chronic indigents or criminals that they're often slandered as being. Donald Trump, of course, is famous for they're all criminals, they're all rapists, they're all awful human, they're not even human. However, the reality remains that they are illegal in their status. They are illegal. Laws do matter, and if the rule of law is to be meaningful, the laws must be upheld. It is disrespectful to those who go through the legal channels to ignore enforcing the laws on those who flout them. Nevertheless, the presence of large numbers of illegal immigrants signifies a larger problem that isn't solved by enforcing immigration laws and militarizing borders. That's not the solution. Immigrants are people crossing borders. People cross borders for reasons. So let's think about borders, because that's the other side of this. You've got people and you have borders. A poet once wrote that good fences make good neighbors. Good boundaries are healthy, but then what constitutes a good boundary? For a person? For a neighborhood? For a whole country? National borders are fences, whether or not there is a physical fence to go with the legal fence. Sometimes borders are physically substantial, a body of water or a mountain range. Sometimes borders are imaginary, a line on a map with no corresponding geographical marker. Either way, borders between nations are legal demarcations that for good or ill separate people. Born on one side of a line, and you are a citizen of one country. Born even a few meters away, on the other side of the line, and you are a citizen of another country. You didn't get to choose. You're thrown into that country. Because most borders aren't insurmountable barriers, or even natural barriers at all, people who live on either side of a border aren't in practice all that separated. National borders can cut through communities that share language and customs, creating artificial divisions and artificial conflicts, something that's happened on nearly every continent for a long time. Despite this, the arbitrary borders enforce real distinctions of laws and practices. Philosopher Gloria Anzaldúa, in her book Borderlands, La Frontera de Nu Mestiza, wrote eloquently about artificial borders. The U.S.-Mexican border, where the third world grates against the first and bleeds, and before a scab forms, it hemorrhages again, the lifeblood of two worlds merging to form a third country, a border culture, unquote. Borders, Anzaldúa says, create the division between us and them, but they also are a cultural and psychic terrain that people inhabit. People living in the borderlands along the artificial line between nations are both in this space and between two worlds. That means living within borders of difference, but transcending the binaries of difference. In the case of the U.S.-Mexican border, which Anzaldúa is concentrating on, the people of the borderlands shift between the perspectives of two cultures and bridge the binary opposition created by the artificial national border. Another example is closer to where I live. There is a mountain range that is a political border between the Czech Republic and Poland. But in some ways, the Czech and Polish people living on either side of that border have more in common with each other than they do with their fellow compatriots in their respective capitals, Prague and Warsaw. In a similar vein, I, living here in Prague, may have more in common with people in Warsaw than with people living in the Czech mountains. The people of these borderlands transcend the political borders. Anzaldúa uses this transcendence as a metaphor for the borderlands of race, gender, and sexuality. Living in the borderlands, whether of nationality or any other divisions, is a consciousness. Being aware of the dynamics of differences and similarities can enable people to live and thrive outside oppressive structures and outside of or between the binaries of difference. So let's think about people here. Talked about borders, let's really talk about people. Perception and reality collide when people cross borders. Immigrants by any name are still people. Laws and borders should not be tools to strip others of their human rights. Beyond legalities, cultural attitudes towards immigrants erect artificial borders that divide people into categories of acceptable and unacceptable. An underestimated conflict is that between cultural homogeneity and cosmopolitanism. It is a deep irony that much anti-immigrant feeling by the right wing is motivated by a desire for cultural homogeneity. Throughout history, immigrants have brought their cultures to their new homes. Most people have welcomed and incorporated these cultural influences. For example, think about which foods are part of your diet, from tacos to pizza, and realize how much immigration and cosmopolitanism have enhanced your life. The cosmopolitan influences of immigrants tend to win out in the long term, but throughout history there has been resistance to it. Fear of the other, so common in people, naturally extends to fear of immigrants and their different cultural practices. Sometimes there are truly incompatible normative differences, but often the differences are superficial and insignificant. One can welcome people of different cultures as a way to learn from new experiences. One could also be intransigent and demand that there be no differences in cultural expressions by immigrant groups. The latter is seen in the demands that immigrants integrate into society. The problem is that the demand that immigrants must adopt our country's culture and values expresses the demand for assimilation, not integration. Integration is mutual borrowing, the bridging of the binary opposition for which Anzoldua called. On the one hand, the demand for cultural homogeneity is the privilege of the dominant class. We can see this in the colonial behaviors of the English and French abroad in contrast to their demands of immigrants in England and France to assimilate, to abandon their culture and take on the culture of England or France. In other words, it is okay for the colonialists to immigrate to other lands and demand a right to live in segregation from the native people, islands of supposedly superior colonial culture amidst the primitive native culture. However, when those native populations come to the colonizer's nation to work menial jobs, their cultures are disrespected, if not denied and prohibited. Now, on the other hand, it sometimes happens that immigrants take over a neighborhood and turn the former inhabitants into outsiders. This is uncomfortable for all involved. Immigrants do have a responsibility to live compatibly with the culture of their adopted country. My right to live in the Czech Republic is and should be dependent on my following the laws and norms of this nation, respecting the people around me and their ways. I have no right to demand a segregated community for my ways. Always, above all, we should be treating people as people, no matter the language they speak or the cultural ways they follow. So, what am I? Right-wing politicians say immigrants are a problem, a danger. They complain about immigrants in the US, and they complain about immigrants here in Europe. Who are they complaining about? Well, not about me. And to be honest, it isn't because I took the legal route. Not entirely, if that factors at all in this anti-immigrant rhetoric. The right-wingers aren't complaining about this university professor immigrating to another country, even though, as a rule, right-wingers aren't terribly welcoming to university professors. Let's be brutally honest. The reason they don't complain about me is because I'm a white guy. They're bothered by non-white people. I will call the bluff of the right-wing politicians. The right-wingers in the United States, the right-wingers in the UK, the right-wingers in Germany, the right-wingers in the Netherlands, everywhere. Their anti-immigrant rhetoric isn't anti-immigrant, but anti a subgroup of people, the same minority groups they oppose regardless of immigration status. A Syrian, Nigerian, or Pakistani with the same levels of income and education as I have would not be afforded the same tolerance that I enjoy. So what am I? Not an expat, because I decline that aloofness. I'm not an expat. I'm not a refugee, because I could return to the land of my birth. I'm not an alien, because no one is, despite racist attitudes. I'm not a migrant, because I'm here to stay. 7 years and counting. I get 10 years before I have to renew my permanent residency card, but I will not be stripped of my permanent residency status, no matter how long I stay here, as long as I obey the law. I am an immigrant, just not the immigrant the right-wingers want you to fear. But here remains the issues of legalities and circumstances. We must make distinctions between legal and illegal immigration, and who is a refugee and under what terms, but we must never forget that we are dealing with people. Opposition to immigrants is a tool of political exploitation. It's as old as humanity itself, and it's very common today. Dehumanizing immigrants as migrants or aliens is common but never acceptable. The legalities of borders and the realities of movement across them are complicated but can only be solved by discussions that never forget that these are people who have human rights.